Djurkovic. Yes.
Okay. Hello, Maria Djurkovic, production designer of the Imitation Game. Let's talk about what was the biggest challenge that you faced in designing this production?
Rather than having specific things like saying, you know, the machine or finding the period correct equipment that you see in the film, I think actually the biggest challenge was to create something, to create Bletchley Park, to create this whole World War II environment that didn't feel tired or something that we've seen 100 times before. I think that was actually the biggest challenge.
Right. And how did you go about achieving that?
I think I wasn't remotely scared of using colour. There's a lot of very strong colour in it. And that came, again, not something that I imposed on it. I think it's very important that you start from the script and you start from the material. And in my case, I always do a lot of research. And actually, that use of colour came from the research material. The actual Christopher that there's a replica of at Bletchley Park, it does have red cables spilling out of it. I used a lot of red. Military police wear those uniforms that are khaki coloured with the red hat. The Alan Turing drawings and his designs, which we found a lot of references for at Bletchley Park, red figures in those as well. So I find that when I do my historical research, I literally wallpaper the art department from floor to ceiling with the references that are very much the foundations and the starting point for me. So number one, it works as a tool of communication. Everybody gets to see the world that we're going to eventually actually physically be creating in the film. But also, it's very interesting how I feel in the same way as that a script has to be the starting point for any production design. The research always comes at the tone, the color palette always come out of that. And I don't feel I have to adhere to it and be absolutely, you know, completely tied down by the historical references. But I do want to know, I want to have a very solid grounding that I can then base everything on, so that every decision I make is an informed one.
Right. And now, of course, you're also dealing with a film that not only takes place during a period, but during 3 different periods. You've got predominantly the 40s and some in the 50s and the 30s.
20s.
20s, yes, right. So how do you show the difference in those times?
That's very easy. That's actually very easy, because that is where the historical, you know, the furnishings, the colours, whatever change, and that's the straightforward bit. Again, the more difficult bit is actually making it one aesthetic whole. The film has to, it has to be this homogeneous thing. So you're actually finding 3 different periods, 3 completely different sets of locations, and you're trying to find something that actually visually ties them all together. Right.
Now, of course, you not only were tasked with designing the sets in this film, but you have to design Christopher, the machine in it.
We have to design everything that you see in the film that's not on the actors.
Right.
So that's, you know, choosing locations, designing the sets that are built, all the set dressing, all the props, the prop makes, vehicles is us as well, special effects is us as well. So it's you know, animals is us. I don't think there were very many animals.
I was going to say,
no, I don't think so, but it is under our remit.
We'll talk a bit about the computer, because you're dealing with something that is historically well known. Talk about the design of it, building it.
Okay, so yes, that was a challenge, because we had to create it completely from scratch.
Right.
We based our designs on Bletchley Park, which is a museum, and they supplied us with an awful lot, all their archival information, photographs. They have a replica of Christopher. So we were able to go and study the thing and measure it and photograph it. But again, as I said, I start with the research as the foundations of my work, and then you build on it. So we actually, Morten and I went to look at this thing. The first thing we did was do a visit to Bletchley Park and look at this. And we, you know, instantly we felt we needed to extrapolate from the reality and make it something that was going to be more cinematic and more emblematic and more powerful, and you know, work as part of the film. So our version is actually really quite accurate, and I really, really hope that people that know and actually understand how that machine works will look at it and not think this is some crazy prop that they've come up with.
Right.
You know, so you're trying to do two things with it. You're trying to make something that's credible, but you're also trying to make something that looks rather wonderful in its own way. The red cables spilling out of it, that the real thing had red cables spilling out of it. I didn't make that up. I certainly exaggerated them.
Right.
So, you know, it's always a question of balance. What we do is just getting the right balance between the bits that we are basing on reality, the bits that we're making up, the artistic license. I mean, Morten and I looked at this thing. We made it, I think our version is 2 foot taller than the real thing. It was obvious that the inner workings were actually more interesting than the reality of it, which just sits in one box. So we made a decision that our version would sort of split into and open up like a book. Another challenge that we had, which is just a purely practical one, is that in the film you see the machine being made in several stages. You see it at a very basic framework stage, then you see it halfway done, and then you see the thing complete. We had to incorporate those stages into our design, because we're shooting those scenes, you know, over the course of 2 days, and you can't keep the shooting crew waiting. So you have to actually incorporate those stages in a kit form, you know, building block form, that you can pull it apart and put it together again very quickly and not keep everybody waiting and they start, you know, getting annoyed with you. So that's part of the design as well. So you're always, that's the machine in a funny kind of way is almost, that is, the job works on so many different levels. I always feel, you know, you're working as a historian, as a sociologist, as a psychologist as well, because you're creating people's homes, you're creating something that every decision that you take about a character's home has to tell you something about that character.
Right.
So, you know, you're working on so many different levels, and it's always about getting the balance right, where, you know, and you're aestheticizing, there's no question about it. You're trying to give the film its, you know, aesthetic, its look.
Right. Now you mentioned Bletchley Park a couple of times.
Yes.
Which is where you shot, and which is where...
Well, we actually didn't shoot that much at Bletchley Park. We visited Bletchley Park because that is where the events actually took place.
Right.
And what we ended up shooting at Bletchley, oddly enough, was the bar scene.
Oh, okay.
And one scene that has nothing to do with code breaking. We shot an interior living room at Bletchley. And the reason being that the disposition of the huts at Bletchley simply don't work practically as a film location.
Right.
And, you know, we are making a film. We're not shooting a documentary. So, you know, that was a very starting point. But the fact that they are built too close together, and then there's a car park in the middle that's in the wrong place. So what our job was to do was to recreate Bletchley Park and get the tone of it right and the feel of it right. But we didn't actually shoot the obvious Bletchley scenes at Bletchley.
Right. Now you've talked a lot about recreating the, you know, being historically accurate while also being aesthetically, you know, pleasing, I should say. How does the theme, or say the emotion of the story, influence your work?
Oh,
does it
completely. Of course it does. Absolutely. And part of my job as a production designer is to be completely responsive to the script. That's the number one. That's the number one. And, you know, from the very first reading of a script, as a production designer, you're sort of figuring out how far you're turning up the dial in terms of how obvious your character of the design is going to be. You know, sometimes it's appropriate to turn it right up, and sometimes it's the opposite. You need to be very quiet. You need to be almost imperceptible, and that is a sort of very much a response to the material that you're reading and working to enhance on every level.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Does that do it for you?
I've heard them come through the door a couple of times, so I think that'll have to do it for me. Thank you very much.
All right, not at all.